So, hello everyone. My name is Ariana Athy. I come from Gisborne in New Zealand, as I said to some of you before, but I'm currently a clinical psychology student at the University of Auckland. And I have also recently completed a master's degree at the University of Waikato. So today I'll be presenting this research to you alongside my supervisor, Professor Tashionu Milfont. So yeah, thank you for having me over Zoom today. And yeah, let's begin. So as we all know, climate change poses a huge threat to the environment, but it also poses a huge threat to numerous human rights, such as food, water, and shelter. And in New Zealand, climate change is predicted to worsen the socioeconomic disparities that are already faced by Māori by disproportionately impacting more vulnerable and Indigenous communities. So given that climate change is so strongly related to human rights, the United Nations has proposed a rights-based climate change response, which would place responsibility on governments to address these human rights violations of climate change, and would protect more vulnerable populations and make the consequences of climate change more concrete and easier to prioritise in the legal system. So our study begins to look at whether this response would be supported by New Zealand. So we know that the public is more likely to support policies that align with their beliefs. And so here we examine the relationship between support for human rights and climate change beliefs. So we draw on literature that has examined the predictors of climate change beliefs and human rights support separately to help us understand this relationship. And there have been many common demographic and socio-psychological predictors between these two constructs. So, for example, people with a liberal political orientation, women and ethnic minorities are all more likely to believe in climate change and support human rights than other people. And in contrast, two personality traits that have been consistently linked to lower support for human rights and climate change beliefs are social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism. So SDO just briefly reflects a tendency to agree with social hierarchies, and RWA reflects the tendency to follow traditional societal norms and show aggression to those who don't conform. So we know that there are these commonalities between people who support human rights and believe in climate change. And even though prior research hasn't directly tested a relationship between human rights support and climate change beliefs, there is a range of research that indicates that having greater concern for humanity, so valuing humanity or having greater empathy, is associated with pro-environmental attitudes and greater concern for the environment. And along with that, two surveys have found that humanitarian issues are considered to be a similar level of importance to environmental issues by the public. So considering all of this research, we predict to see a positive relationship between climate change beliefs and human rights support. So to begin to investigate this relationship, we asked three questions. The first, is there a longitudinal association between support for human rights and climate change beliefs? The second, are there subgroups within the New Zealand population who produce unique response patterns to the human rights and climate change items? And finally, what is the stability versus transition of membership to unique response profiles over a 1-year period? Or in other words, if subgroups do exist, are they stable over a year? So to answer these questions, we use data from the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study, which is a nationwide study that has collected information about the socio-political attitudes of the New Zealand population since 2009. And we used two waves of data from 2013 and 2014 because these were the years that the NZAVS included the human rights items. And we examined the responses of over 17,000 adults who answered both the human rights and climate change items. So we used two measures of human rights included in the NZAVS, and more specifically, we used one that focused on economic rights of citizens or the right to fair pay, and one that focused on more fundamental physical rights such as the right to food and water. And for climate change, we looked at the belief that climate change is real, that climate change is caused by humans, and we also measured concern for climate change. And so using this data from the NZAVS, we conducted 3 separate analyses on M+, both variable-centred and person-centred analyses to answer our 3 research questions. So for our first analysis, the cross-lagged analysis, we wanted to test whether climate change beliefs and support for human rights predicted each other over 1 year. So a cross-lagged analysis tests these longitudinal relationships while also controlling for the stability of each item over time. So this figure shows these cross-lagged relationships between the human rights items at time 1 on the left, predicting the climate change items at time 2 on the right. So as circled in blue, we found that support for these physical human rights predicted all 3 climate change beliefs longitudinally, whereas support for economic human rights only predicted the belief that climate change is real, as circled in red. Similarly, this figure displays the climate change items at time 1, predicting the human rights items at time 2. And again, as circled in blue, we found that believing that climate change is real, believing that it's caused by humans, and being concerned about climate change predicted support for those physical human rights after a year. But again, only the belief that climate change is real predicted support for human rights, for economic human rights, sorry. So just to sum that up briefly, we found that support for physical human rights is bidirectionally associated with more climate change beliefs and concern over time compared to support for economic human rights. And these results also remained after controlling for demographic and socio-psychological predictors. And this is particularly interesting because it means that the relationship between human rights support and climate change beliefs isn't so clear-cut. In terms of why we might have found a stronger relationship between the physical human rights item and the climate change items, our physical rights item, as you can see at the bottom there, covers a broad range of human rights, broader than our economic rights item, which is strictly limited to just and reasonable pay. So this means that the economic item only protects the needs of really one societal group, so people who are employed, whereas the physical item protects the needs of a range of societal groups, such as people who are homeless or unemployed. And considering that this research, that prior research has found a relationship between humanitarian concerns and environmental concerns already, it may be the case that the human rights support and climate change relationship is more associated with people who support the rights of humanity as a whole, and support for the economic rights item might not reflect the support for wider humanity or even greater empathy. But due to the exploratory nature of the study and the lack of research examining human rights and climate change, this is only one possible explanation. So despite the fact that the economic rights item was associated with less climate change items, it was still associated with the belief that climate change is real. And this is important because believing that climate change is real has been found to increase pro-environmental behaviour and support for climate change policies. So individuals who support human rights in general are more likely to hold these pro-environmental beliefs than people who don't support human rights. So turning now to our second analysis, we used a latent profile analysis to look at whether subgroups exist in the New Zealand population who hold unique response patterns to the human rights and climate change items. And we found that the patterns of beliefs could be summed up into 4 subgroups based on those who held similar human rights and climate change beliefs. And we found that each of these groups had high support for human rights, which shows us that the general New Zealand population is supportive of human rights. And we've indicated this by putting rights-based at for the names of each subgroup. But where these groups differed was their climate change beliefs. So the smallest group of only 6% of the population was the rights-based anthropogenic denier and unconcerned profile, a bit of a mouthful. So despite believing in the existence of climate change, members of this profile don't believe that climate change is caused by humans and aren't concerned about climate change. The second smallest profile Only 8.9% of the population don't believe in the existence of climate change at all, and obviously don't have concern for it. But the good news is that the two largest profiles at the bottom there had a higher belief in climate change. So the rights-based neutral believer and unconcerned profile had a moderate belief that climate change is real and that it's caused by humans, but they weren't extremely concerned about climate change. But the largest profile, with over 56% of the population, had strong beliefs that climate change is real, that it's caused by humans, and a deep concern for climate change. So this is great news because it indicates that a large part of the New Zealand population is generally aware of and concerned about climate change. We also found across these 4 subgroups, climate change concern was lower than the belief that climate change is real. So what this means is that even though people may strongly believe that climate change is real and that it's caused by humans, these beliefs don't necessarily lead to an equally high level of concern. And this makes sense because prior research has found that there is a sort of mental disengagement that occurs around climate change. So where its spatially and temporally distant nature make it difficult to perceive as a threat. So its risks are sort of unclear and it has future consequences. And many countries haven't actually experienced those sort of concrete consequences of climate change. So it's easy to ignore and not be so concerned about. So following on from the latent profile analysis, we used a multinomial logistic regression to test whether specific demographic and socio-psychological traits make people more likely to be a member of certain profiles than others. So firstly, we found that Māori are more likely than New Zealand Europeans to strongly believe in climate change and be concerned about climate change. And this aligns with prior research that has found that Māori cultural identity correlates positively with connection to the environment and pro-environmental attitudes. And along with ethnicity, we found that people who have a lower social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism score, along with people of a liberal political orientation, are all generally more likely to be a member of the profile that has the highest belief in and concern about climate change than the other profiles. And just to summarise that one, our latent profile analysis revealed that support for human rights is high, regardless of climate change beliefs, and most people believe in and are concerned about climate change in New Zealand, with some demographic and socio-psychological traits influencing profile membership. And just moving on to our final latent transition analysis, where we extended on the latent profile analysis to test whether these subgroups that we just talked about before are stable or unstable over time. So this figure here represents the movement between profiles over a 1-year period. So the arrows represent that movement, and the little half circles there represent the percentage of people who stayed within that profile after a year. And what we can see here at the bottom is that people who strongly believe in and are concerned about climate change are still likely to believe in climate change after a year, with over 93.5% people remaining in this profile. But we found that climate change skepticism is more unstable, with around 55 to 61% of people remaining in these profiles of lower climate change beliefs and concern after a year. So instead, these people in these profiles actually appear to be increasing their belief in climate change, with some of the largest transitions shown here circled occurring from profiles of low belief to high belief. So just to summarise that one, climate change skepticism is unstable and people appear to be increasing their belief in climate change over time. So what does this mean for a rights-based response? Theoretically, our study is the first to test and show that there is a relationship between support for human rights and belief in climate change. And we also show for the first time that the New Zealand population is highly supportive of human rights and that climate change skepticism is unstable, which is good news because it shows that more people are starting to believe in climate change. On a more practical note, our findings indicate that a rights-based response has the potential to gain widespread public support in particular, that a large proportion of the population already strongly believes in climate change, and most people support human rights, which may make the response appeal to a broader range of people than other responses. And importantly, Indigenous voices are often neglected when designing climate change responses. So identifying and acknowledging Māori views on climate change and human rights is an important step to ensure that these Indigenous rights knowledge are incorporated into these responses. So our results show that a rights-based response would align with Māori beliefs about climate change and human rights, which also means it has the potential to encourage more meaningful engagement with Māori. So here is just a couple of other recent works looking at Māori human rights in relation to climate change. So we currently have an article under review, which was led by Nathan Hoturoa, which summarises the different Indigenous knowledge that Māori can use and that can be drawn on to address climate change. And also a recent report co-authored by Associate Professor Bridget Masters-Awatere, also from the University of Waikato, explaining in more detail the impact of climate change on Māori communities. And just to briefly touch on the limitations of this study, we were restricted to using the 2 human rights items and the 3 climate change items in the NZAVS. So it is difficult to generalise our results to any broader human rights. And along with that, the high support that we found for human rights may simply reflect social norms rather than an actual commitment to human rights, in which case measuring commitment may have produced different results with the climate change beliefs. And finally, such a large proportion of the population having support for human rights and believing in climate change doesn't necessarily indicate that these same people would support a rights-based response, and we didn't measure that specifically in our study. Sorry. So given that our study is the first to bridge these 2 constructs together, it is a broadly exploratory study, and our findings leave a lot of room for future research to expand on. So for one, future research should examine the mechanisms behind why some human rights are related to climate change beliefs more than others. So this would allow us to better understand why we seem to find that humanitarian concerns are sort of associated with those environmental concerns. And future research should also test whether the instability that we found for those profiles of lower climate change beliefs replicate over longer time periods, and then from here, examine why some of these people hold their beliefs over time while others don't. And this would allow us to know how to more effectively target climate change deniers who may be resistant to supporting climate change responses. And just to finish off the presentation, we just have an acknowledgement here. So we dedicated our article under review in Current Research in Ecological and Social Psychology to the memory of Professor Sam G. McFarland, who passed away in January. So he made significant contributions to the field of political psychology and devoted the latter part of his career to human rights, which inspired and taught me a lot about all of this topic, essentially. So yeah. Yeah, any questions?